London, May 1945. The streets explode with celebration as the war in Europe finally ends. But in the back rooms of British armories, another story is just beginning. 7 million Webley Revolvers, the iconic British sidearm that served in 2 world wars, are being pulled from service. These weren't just guns. They were the revolvers that stormed trenches in 1916, held the line at Dunkirk, and accompanied commandos on secret raids across occupied Europe. Within weeks, these weapons would begin a journey more bizarre than their war service itself, a journey that would take them from the hands of British officers to the bargain bins of American hardware stores, sold for less than the price of a tank of gasoline. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to 7 million Webley Revolvers after the guns fell silent? To understand the scale of what vanished, you need to understand what the Webley represented. From 1887 to 1963, the Webley Revolver was the standard issue sidearm of the British Armed Forces. During World War I alone, over 300,000 of the Mark VI model were produced. By the end of World War II, production numbers had exploded. The British Commonwealth Forces had commissioned millions of these top-break revolvers in various marks and models. The Webley Mark IV, the Enfield number 2, and the legendary Mark VI filled the holsters of officers, tank crews, military police, and rear echelon troops across every theatre of war. These weren't ceremonial pieces. They were working weapons built like bank vaults capable of firing the hefty .455 Webley cartridge or the slightly smaller .38/200 round. Each revolver weighed nearly 2.5 pounds empty and could punch through a steel helmet at close range. The immediate aftermath of victory created an unprecedented logistical nightmare. Between May and September 1945, the British War Office faced a staggering problem. Millions of small arms were scattered across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Every returning soldier, every demobilized unit, every captured enemy stockpile added to mountains of weaponry that needed accounting. The Webley Revolvers came flooding back to Britain by the hundreds of thousands. Ships arrived daily at Liverpool, Southampton, and Portsmouth carrying crates marked with broad arrows, the symbol of British military property. Inside these crates, wrapped in oiled paper that had protected them from salt spray and tropical humidity, were revolvers that had seen everything from the deserts of El Alamein to the jungles of Burma. Within the first 6 months after VE Day, British military depots became overwhelmed. The Royal Army Ordnance Corps established massive sorting centres where weapons were inspected, catalogued, and separated into categories. Webleys in good condition went to one building, those with minor damage to another. Completely worn-out revolvers, their barrels shot out and frames cracked from years of hard use, were marked for immediate destruction. Imagine walking through these depots in late 1945. Row upon row of wooden tables stretching the length of aircraft hangars. Armourers in brown coats methodically checking each revolver, spinning cylinders, examining bores with practiced eyes. The smell of gun oil and cosmoline hung thick in the air. The metallic clicks of thousands of revolvers being function tested created a constant percussion, like mechanical rain on a tin roof. But Britain had a problem beyond mere storage. The nation was bankrupt. 6 years of total war had drained the treasury to nothing. The country owed massive debts to the United States and couldn't afford to maintain enormous stockpiles of obsolete weapons. The decision came down from Whitehall with brutal efficiency. The Webley Revolver was obsolete. The British military was transitioning to semi-automatic pistols. There was no strategic reason to maintain millions of revolvers that fired ammunition the military was phasing out. The order was given: dispose of them. But disposal meant different things to different people. And this is where our mystery truly begins. The first wave of destruction started in 1946 and was merciless in its scale. At scrapyards across Britain, industrial crushers began their work. Foremen directed workers to load crate after crate of Webley revolvers onto conveyor belts. These weren't careful operations. Revolvers were dumped by the hundreds into crushing machines designed to process scrap metal for Britain's reconstruction. The sound was apocalyptic. Steel frames screaming as hydraulic presses compressed them into blocks no bigger than a bread box. Wooden grips splintered and burned in furnaces. Blued steel barrels that had been carefully machined and heat-treated were reduced to raw metal in minutes. One scrapyard worker in Birmingham later recalled that in the summer of 1946, his facility processed an estimated 50,000 revolvers in just 3 months. The metal was remelted and poured into ingots, destined to become parts for tractors, construction girders, and cooking pots in Britain's new peacetime economy. But not all 7 million revolvers met the crusher. The British military had another disposal method: foreign military aid. Between 1946 and 1950, hundreds of thousands of Webley revolvers were shipped to Commonwealth nations and allies as part of military assistance programs. India, newly independent in 1947, received enormous quantities of British small arms, including tens of thousands of Webley revolvers. Pakistan, splitting from India in partition, also received substantial numbers. These weapons would serve for decades more in the hands of police forces and military units across the subcontinent. Australia and New Zealand, having used Webleys throughout the war, retained large stocks for their own reserve forces and police departments. In Australia, state police forces would continue using Webley revolvers well into the 1970s, particularly in rural areas where the robust design proved ideal for rough conditions. Canada presented a unique case in the Webley's post-war journey. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had purchased thousands of Webley revolvers during the war years, primarily the .38/200 models. After 1945, these revolvers entered civilian police service across Canadian provinces. But Canadian winters and the harsh conditions of northern patrols revealed something remarkable about the Webley design. While more modern semi-automatic pistols would jam in extreme cold, the simple mechanical action of the Webley kept functioning. Mounties working in Yukon and Northwest Territories often preferred the old Webleys to newer issue weapons. Some of these Canadian service Webleys would remain in active police use until the early 1980s, making them among the longest-serving military revolvers in Western military history. The real story, however, the one that captivates collectors and historians today, is what happened when American law changed in 1968. The Gun Control Act of 1968 fundamentally altered firearms importation into the United States. Before this legislation, surplus military weapons could be imported with relatively few restrictions. American surplus dealers had long-standing relationships with British, Canadian, and Australian disposal agencies. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, these dealers imported container loads of military surplus firearms. Webley revolvers, considered obsolete by modern military standards, were perfect candidates for the American surplus market. They were cheap to acquire, historically significant, and there was enormous demand from American shooters who appreciated solid, well-made firearms. The floodgates opened widest between 1958 and 1968. This was the golden age of military surplus importation to America. British armories, still working through enormous stockpiles from World War II, were eager to sell. The revolvers came in various conditions. Some were factory refurbished, looking nearly new with fresh bluing and new grips. Others showed honest wear, holster marks, minor pitting, the patina of years of service. Each revolver bore proof marks on the frame and cylinder, the crown over broad arrow proving British military acceptance, date stamps and inspection marks from long-dead armourers at Enfield or Webley factories. Import companies like Interarms, Century Arms, and Golden State Arms brought in hundreds of thousands of these revolvers. Here's where the story takes its strangest turn. In the rush to clear inventory before the 1968 Gun Control Act took effect, American retailers found themselves with warehouses full of these British revolvers. The law's passage meant that additional imports would face strict requirements and point systems that made older revolvers commercially non-viable. Retailers needed to move existing stock immediately. Hardware stores, sporting goods shops, and farm supply retailers across America became unlikely arms dealers. True Value Hardware, Coast to Coast, and independent hardware stores ordered revolvers by the case lot. In small-town America, you could walk into your local hardware store in 1968 and find a barrel, literally a barrel, full of Webley revolvers with a hand-lettered sign, British Army Surplus, $4.95 each. The prices were staggering in their cheapness. A Webley Mark VI, a revolver that had served British officers through the hell of the Somme and survived 2 world wars, cost less than a decent pocket knife. Some stores priced them even lower to move inventory before the law's implementation deadline. Newspaper advertisements from 1968 show Webley revolvers advertised alongside hammer drills and paint supplies. British Webley .38 military revolver was $12.95, now only $5, limit 2 per customer. Americans bought them by the thousands. Farmers purchased them as truck guns and vermin control tools. Target shooters bought them for weekend plinking. Military veterans who had served alongside British forces bought them as mementos. Collectors, recognizing historical value that retailers didn't understand, bought them by the case. But these weren't always pristine collectibles. The British military, before releasing revolvers for surplus sale, often implemented destruction policies that stopped just short of actual destruction. Beginning in the late 1950s, British armourers received orders to demilitarize revolvers being sold as surplus. This meant using a cutting torch to slice through the top strap of the revolver's frame, rendering it mechanically non-functional while keeping it largely intact for collectors. Tens of thousands of Webleys were torch-cut this way. However, the implementation of this policy was wildly inconsistent. Some armories cut every single revolver. Others cut only a percentage. Some apparently didn't cut any, either through oversight, deliberate non-compliance by sympathetic armourers, or because the revolvers had already left British military control and entered civilian channels through Commonwealth countries that had no such restrictions. This created a secondary market that exists to this day. A torch-cut Webley is worth a fraction of an intact one, but American gunsmiths quickly realized that top straps could be professionally welded and refinished. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, small machine shops across America developed expertise in Webley restoration. The process wasn't simple. The frame had to be precisely aligned and welded using proper metallurgy to handle the stresses of firing. Then the entire revolver needed re-bluing or refinishing. Finally, it had to be proof-tested to ensure safety. A properly restored Webley could be made fully functional and safe, though purists argued that the historical integrity was compromised. Today, collectors debate the ethics and value of restored versus original cut revolvers. An uncut original military Webley in excellent condition might bring $800 to $1,200 at auction. A professionally restored example might fetch $400 to $600. A cut example, kept as a historical artifact, might sell for $150 to $250. The strangest stories of Webley survival come from the most unlikely places. In 2003, a construction crew demolishing a Victorian-era warehouse in Liverpool discovered a sealed room that hadn't been opened since 1946. Inside were 127 Webley Mark VI revolvers, packed in original wooden crates with arsenal markings. They had been stored and simply forgotten as the warehouse changed hands multiple times over decades. The revolvers were covered in decades of dust but remained in remarkable condition thanks to their original Cosmoline preservation. British authorities seized them, and after legal proceedings, they were eventually deactivated and sold to collectors. Each revolver told a story through its markings. Manufacture dates ranging from 1915 to 1918, proof marks showing service inspection dates from various years of World War I, unit markings scratched or stamped by armourers tracking their assignment. In Australia, a similar discovery occurred in 2011 when a retired police station in rural New South Wales was being cleared for demolition. Behind a false wall in the basement armoury, workers found 43 Webley .38/200 revolvers that had apparently been hidden there in the 1950s. Local police historians speculated that an armourer, facing orders to destroy the revolvers but recognizing their historical value, had simply walled them up instead. The discovery made national news in Australia. The revolvers, after decades in darkness, showed surface rust but were mechanically intact. The New South Wales Police Museum acquired them for their collection, and several were restored for display showing the evolution of police sidearms in Australia. Perhaps the most remarkable survival story involves the Indian subcontinent. When India gained independence in 1947, the British Indian Army was divided between India and Pakistan. Enormous quantities of British military equipment, including hundreds of thousands of Webley revolvers, remained in the region. These revolvers entered service with police forces, reserve military units, and home guard organizations across both nations. Many eventually filtered into the civilian market through legitimate sales, government surplus auctions, and less official channels. Today, Indian and Pakistani gun markets still occasionally see Webley revolvers appear, often bearing markings showing service in famous British Indian Army regiments, the Gurkha Rifles, the Rajputana Rifles, Sikh regiment units. These revolvers carry marks in Hindi, Urdu, and English, showing their continued service long after British rule ended. Some bear additional markings from their use in the 1947 partition conflicts, the 1965 and 1971 Indo-Pakistani wars, and various internal security operations. The Vietnam War created another unexpected chapter in the Webley story. In the early 1960s, the CIA's covert operations in Southeast Asia required untraceable weapons for arming indigenous forces and conducting deniable operations. Webley revolvers, widely available on international surplus markets and bearing no American markings, became part of these shipments. Montagnard tribesmen fighting alongside American special forces sometimes carried Webleys provided through these channels. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, some of these revolvers were captured and entered Vietnamese military stocks, while others were smuggled out by refugees. In the 1990s, several Webleys with provenance tracing to CIA operations in Laos and Vietnam appeared in American collections, brought back by veterans or acquired from Southeast Asian dealers, each carrying stories that will never be fully documented. The strangest reuse of Webley revolvers occurred in the film and television industry. From the 1950s through the 1980s, British war films were a major genre in cinema. Movies like The Bridge on the River Kwai, The Guns of Navarone, and countless others required period-correct weapons. Webley revolvers, being relatively inexpensive and historically accurate, were purchased by the hundreds by film armourers and prop houses. Many were converted to fire blank cartridges only, a process involving blocking the barrel and modifying the cylinder. These film guns saw more action in their post-war careers than many did during actual service, appearing in dozens of productions. Some are still in use today in period productions. Their decades of film work documented by property masters who track which revolvers appeared in which productions. British gun clubs and target shooting organisations absorbed thousands of Webley revolvers in the decades after the war. The revolver's inherent accuracy and heavy frame, which damped recoil, made it excellent for target shooting. British target shooters in the 1950s and 1960s often used surplus Webley Mark VI revolvers in competition, sometimes accurizing them with new sights and custom grips. These competition guns were maintained meticulously, often in better condition than when they left military service. However, British firearms laws, which tightened dramatically after the Dunblane massacre in 1996, led to mass surrenders and destruction of handguns in Britain. Thousands of Webley revolvers that had survived military service, wars, and decades of civilian ownership were turned into police stations and destroyed in the late 1990s. British firearms clubs and historians watched in dismay as historical artifacts were cut up and crushed. Some estimate that Britain destroyed more Webley revolvers in the firearms buyback of 1997 to 1998 than had been destroyed in all previous decades combined. The Royal Navy created its own distinct chapter in the Webley story. Naval patterns of the Webley, often marked with anchor stamps and naval acceptance marks, served aboard British warships throughout both world wars. These naval Webleys often showed distinctive wear patterns, corrosion from salt air, holster wear on different places on the frame due to how naval officers wore their sidearms, and sometimes engravings indicating which ship they were assigned to. After the war, many naval Webleys remained in Royal Navy stocks much longer than their Army counterparts. Some served aboard British vessels until the 1960s. When finally released from service, these naval-marked revolvers became highly prized by collectors. Examples marked to famous ships, HMS Hood, HMS Belfast, HMS Warspite, command premium prices. One Webley marked to HMS Illustrious, the aircraft carrier that participated in the hunt for the Bismarck and numerous Mediterranean operations, sold at auction in 2019 for over $3,000, nearly triple the price of a comparable Army-issue revolver. American museums became unexpected repositories for Webley history. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the Imperial War Museum in London, the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and dozens of smaller military museums acquired examples for their collections. These institutional holdings preserved revolvers that might otherwise have been destroyed or lost to history. Museum collections often include not just the revolvers themselves, but associated items, period holsters, cleaning kits, ammunition pouches, loading accessories. Some museums acquired revolvers with extraordinary provenance. The Imperial War Museum holds a Webley, carried by a British officer during the evacuation of Dunkirk, complete with documentation and photographs of the officer. The revolver shows damage consistent with its story, saltwater corrosion, impact marks, physical evidence of history that no document can fully capture. Private collectors became the ultimate preservers of Webley history. From the 1960s onward, as military surplus markets flooded with these revolvers, serious collectors began acquiring examples spanning the entire production history. Collection focuses varied widely. Some collectors pursued one of every mark and variant. Others collected based on manufacture date, trying to acquire examples from every year of production. Still others focused on proof marks, unit markings, or condition. The most serious collectors documented their acquisitions meticulously, researching serial numbers against production records, matching date codes to historical events, and preserving the stories behind individual revolvers. Today, several private collections contain over 100 examples each, representing museum-quality holdings in private hands. The collector market revealed surprising details about production and survival rates. Serial number research showed that certain batches of Webley revolvers have far higher survival rates than others. Revolvers produced during World War I and issued to frontline units have lower survival rates. They saw the hardest use, were more likely to be lost in combat, and were more thoroughly worn out by decades of service. Revolvers produced during World War II, particularly those made in 1943 to 1944 and issued to rear echelon units, have much higher survival rates. Many saw minimal actual use and were placed into storage almost immediately after the war. Similarly, revolvers issued to Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia, which faced less intense combat and had better storage facilities, survived in higher percentages than those that remained in British service. Modern ballistic testing has revealed why these revolvers remain desirable long after their military obsolescence. When firearms researchers tested vintage Webley Mark VI revolvers loaded with appropriate ammunition, they found the weapons were still capable of remarkable accuracy. At 25 yards, a well-maintained Webley could place 6 shots into a 4-inch group, more than adequate for defensive or hunting purposes. The revolver's top-break design, often criticized by modern shooters as weaker than solid-frame revolvers, proved to be incredibly durable when tested. Webley frames could handle tens of thousands of rounds before showing mechanical wear. This durability explains why so many survived decades of hard use and remain functional today, nearly 80 years after production ended. The ammunition question created its own subset of Webley history. The original .455 Webley cartridge fell out of production by most manufacturers by the 1970s. This should have rendered millions of .455 Webley revolvers obsolete. However, American wildcatters and ammunition manufacturers recognized a market opportunity. Companies began producing .455 Webley ammunition specifically for the American surplus market. Additionally, shooters discovered that .45 Colt ammunition could be fired in .455 Webley revolvers with reasonable safety, though headspacing wasn't ideal. The later .38/200 revolvers faced fewer ammunition problems. The cartridge, essentially a .38 Smith & Wesson, remained in production. This ammunition availability allowed Webleys to remain shooting firearms rather than becoming inert collectibles. Law enforcement agencies in developing nations provided another avenue for Webley survival. Throughout the 1950s through 1980s, police forces in former British colonies and Commonwealth nations continued using Webley revolvers. In countries like Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe, and Malaysia, police constables and rural officers carried Webleys well into the 1980s. These service revolvers accumulated decades of additional wear, developing unique characteristics from tropical service, pitting from humidity, wear from constant carry in leather holsters through jungle and savanna. Some of these police service revolvers eventually entered collector markets when these departments finally modernized. They carry markings from police departments long defunct: Kenya Police, Rhodesian British South Africa Police, Straits Settlements Police, each marking telling a story of colonial and post-colonial law enforcement history. The memorial and commemorative use of Webley revolvers represents another form of survival. Military units, regimental museums, and veteran organizations often retained Webleys as memorial pieces. These revolvers, sometimes mounted in display cases or kept in unit safes, commemorated fallen soldiers or significant battles. Some were formally deactivated, having their barrels blocked and actions welded, but preserved as artifacts. Others remained functional but were treated as sacred objects, only displayed on regimental anniversaries or memorial services. The Royal British Legion, Britain's veteran organisation, holds several such revolvers in trust, each associated with specific Victoria Cross recipients or famous unit actions. Recent years have seen increased interest in battlefield archaeology, and Webley revolvers have emerged from the ground decades after being lost or discarded. Metal detector enthusiasts working old battlefields in France and Belgium occasionally discover revolvers that fell from holsters or were dropped in the chaos of combat. These recovered revolvers show the effects of decades underground: severe corrosion, wood grips rotted away, mechanisms frozen solid. Yet even in this condition, they possess historical value. Battlefield recovery revolvers can sometimes be traced to specific units or actions through their serial numbers. One Webley recovered near Passchendaele in 2008 was traced to a British officer killed in 1917. Through military records and family genealogy, researchers located the officer's descendants in Canada, and the revolver was returned to the family. The officer's great-grandson placed it in a museum, completing a journey that had taken 91 years. The technical legacy of the Webley design influenced firearms development worldwide. The top break action, while considered old-fashioned by the 1940s, represented a peak of refinement for that mechanism. When the top latch was released, the barrel assembly hinged downward, simultaneously activating an extractor that lifted all cartridge cases from the cylinder. This allowed for faster reloading than the traditional swing-out cylinder. Though other designs ultimately proved more popular, the Webley's robust construction and reliable action influenced revolver design philosophy. Smith & Wesson, Colt, and other manufacturers studied captured Webleys during and after World War II, incorporating lessons about frame strength and lockwork design into their own products. Today, in 2026, the Webley Revolver exists in a strange twilight. Production ceased decades ago. No military force issues them, yet they remain remarkably present in shooting sports, collections, and popular culture. Cowboy action shooting, a competitive sport where participants dress in period costume and shoot reproduction Old West firearms, has embraced the Webley. Shooters portraying British Army officers or Victorian-era characters use Webley revolvers in competition. This has created renewed demand, with prices for shootable examples rising steadily. A working Webley Mark VI that sold for $150 in the 1980s might bring $600 to $800 today. Exceptional examples with documented military provenance or rare variants can exceed $2,000. The Internet age has transformed Webley collecting and research. Online forums dedicated to British military firearms allow collectors worldwide to share information, identify markings, and trace individual revolvers' histories. Serial number databases compiled from military records, production logs, and collector submissions now contain information on hundreds of thousands of individual revolvers. A collector can enter a serial number and potentially discover when their revolver was made, which military contracts it fell under, and sometimes even which units it was issued to. This democratization of information has elevated collecting from mere accumulation to serious historical research. Several gunsmiths have developed specialized expertise in Webley repair and restoration. These craftsmen possess skills increasingly rare in modern firearms industry, the ability to hand-fit parts, fabricate replacement components using traditional machining methods, and restore historic finishes. One master gunsmith in Britain, before the 1997 handgun ban forced him to relocate his business to Canada, restored over 3,000 Webley revolvers during his career. His work included everything from simple repairs to complete rebuilds of revolvers so deteriorated they seemed beyond salvation. His documentation of each restoration, complete with photographs and historical research on individual revolvers, now resides in a Canadian firearms museum, a testament to dedication to preserving history. The question of how many Webley revolvers survive today has no definitive answer. Estimates vary wildly. Conservative researchers suggest perhaps 500,000 to 800,000 examples exist worldwide. Optimistic collectors believe the number could be over 1 million. The truth likely falls somewhere between. Many revolvers sit forgotten in attics, stored in footlockers from grandfather's war service. Others gather dust in evidence rooms at police departments, seized decades ago and never properly disposed of. Still more rest in private collections, their existence known only to their owners. Each year brings new discoveries. Estate sales reveal collections, house clearances uncover forgotten guns, and occasionally major caches emerge from military storage. The environmental fate of destroyed Webleys raises haunting questions. Hundreds of thousands were crushed and melted, their steel recycled into peacetime products. This means that the metal from Webley revolvers now exists in countless everyday objects. That park bench might contain steel from revolvers that served at Gallipoli. Your car might incorporate metal from revolvers carried on the Normandy beaches. The bridge you drove across could include steel from revolvers that held the line at Tobruk. The atoms persist even as the form is destroyed, an almost poetic transmutation from weapons of war to instruments of peace. Recent scholarship has begun examining the Webley Revolver not just as a military artifact, but as a cultural object. Academic papers have explored what the mass disposal of these revolvers meant for British identity in the post-war period. The weapon that symbolised British military power for over 70 years was declared obsolete and sold off for pennies. This disposal coincided with Britain's rapid decolonisation and diminished global status. Some historians argue that the Webley's fate paralleled Britain's own transformation from world empire to regional power. The weapon that had enforced British authority from India to Africa to the far corners of empire became a budget bargain in American hardware stores, a powerful metaphor for imperial decline. The Webley's influence on firearms law should not be overlooked. The 1968 Gun Control Act that ended their importation in large numbers fundamentally changed American gun commerce. Before 1968, military surplus firearms flowed freely into America, connecting civilian shooters with military history. After 1968, imports faced point systems and regulatory hurdles that made historical military firearms increasingly expensive and rare. The Webley Revolver, arriving in America by the hundreds of thousands in the final years before this change, represents the end of an era in American gun culture, the last great wave of affordable military surplus before regulation permanently altered the market. Modern computer simulation has allowed historians to answer previously unanswerable questions about Webley's service life. By analysing surviving examples, measuring wear patterns and applying materials science, researchers have estimated that the average Webley Mark VI fired approximately 8,000 to 12,000 rounds during its service life. This means that the 7 million Webley revolvers collectively fired somewhere between 56 billion and 84 billion rounds during their military careers. Each shot represents a moment in history, training on a peaceful range, firing at a charging enemy, or the desperate last shots in hopeless situations. The scale is almost incomprehensible. The final irony of the Webley story is that these obsolete revolvers continue to function perfectly nearly a century after their design. Modern semi-automatic pistols are more complex, hold more ammunition, and reload faster. Yet they also require more maintenance, are more susceptible to environmental conditions, and have more parts that can break. The Webley, with its simple mechanical action and robust construction, simply works. This reliability explains why, even today, in remote parts of former British territories, you can still find police officers, farmers and security guards carrying Webley revolvers for actual defensive purposes. The weapons aren't collectibles to them. They're tools that work, built to a standard of quality that has outlasted empires. Standing in a modern gun shop looking at a Webley revolver for sale, you're not just looking at a firearm. You're looking at a physical connection to history that few objects can match. The revolver's scratches and wear marks are a map of its journey through the 20th century. That holster wear might have come from a British officer's daily carry in India. That ding on the barrel might have occurred during the chaos of Dunkirk. The serial number connects it to a specific day in a specific factory when a specific worker assembled it. The proof marks show inspectors verified its safety. The unit markings might trace to a regiment with a famous history. And its presence in your hands, rather than crushed into scrap, represents thousands of small decisions and accidents that allowed it to survive when millions of its brothers were destroyed. What happened to 7 million Webley revolvers? They were crushed and recycled. They armed police forces across continents. They fought in wars decades after their manufacture. They hung on farmhouse walls. They filled bargain bins in hardware stores. They joined museum collections. They became family heirlooms. They rusted into mud on forgotten battlefields. They trained new generations of shooters. They appeared in films. They were hidden away and discovered decades later. They were cherished by collectors and ignored in attics. They were given new life through restoration or quietly decomposed in evidence lockers. Each of the 7 million has its own story, and those stories continue to unfold. The revolvers that survive today are time travelers, carrying fragments of history from a world utterly different from our own. When you hold a Webley, you hold more than metal and wood. You hold memory, service, survival, and mystery, the physical embodiment of an era when these solid, reliable revolvers represented the reach of an empire and the personal defense of men who carried them into the unknown, never knowing if they would return. The war ended, but for the Webley revolvers, the journey was just beginning.